we're going to continue to think about sex and gender, and especially we're going to look at intersex identities and both historical and ongoing responses to intersex folks. We're especially going to look at how these responses indicate the ways in which our categories of sex and gender actually work. All right, so let's start off with making sure we know what the word intersex means. Someone who is intersex can have a variety of different conditions or bodily configurations. It means that somebody is not simply and clearly classified as either male or female, right? So as we now know, it just isn't the case that everybody has XX chromosomes and an ovaries and ovaries and breasts and a uterus and a clitoris, right? This just isn't the case of how all bodies work. It isn't the case that these things neatly line up with one another. Somebody might have XX chromosomes and testes. Somebody might have XX chromosomes, one uterus, one testy, and external genitalia where it's not super clear if it is a large clitoris or a small penis. Those organs are really similar to one another. And the line between a large clitoris and a small penis it's kind of murky. And it's not clear which feature or characteristic essentially makes somebody either male or female. It's not clear whether it's really, these categories of biological sex are really about chromosomes, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, or hormone levels, right? We're used to thinking about biological sex as if those various features all co-vary with one another. That if somebody has, say, a penis, they will also have testes and XY chromosomes and high levels of testosterone. That's not how things always vary. They don't always travel together like that. Again, there's just a great deal of variation. Bodies are different from person to person. This should not be that surprising. And yet, because we don't talk about intersex identities, we often have the mindset that there is this clear, natural distinction between the categories of male and female. But as we now know, it just isn't that clear. It isn't that distinct. It is often quite murky. All right, so because we don't talk about intersex identities, a lot of folks aren't really aware of the fact that intersex people exist, aren't really aware of the whole history of how intersex folks have been treated. So let's start at the beginning with what happens when a baby is born. So baby is born, the doctors look at their external genitalia, and if it is ambiguous, if it's not quite clear if somebody has, again, a penis or a clitoris, if their external genitalia aren't configured in a way that people are familiar with, the doctors immediately declare a medical emergency. Now that's a huge deal. I'm not sure how to fully emphasize just how big a deal it is that the baby has just been born. They are a tiny infant. They're so little. And doctors declare a medical emergency. We don't usually declare medical emergencies for infants unless they are in immediate danger of serious health consequences or death. We tend not to want to do surgeries on infants because they're so little, they're so vulnerable, they're so fragile. To declare a medical emergency when an intersex child is born is a big deal. It's worth noting, most intersex conditions are not life-threatening. Most intersex conditions are not what we would normally think of as a medical emergency. In fact, most intersex conditions are not bad or harmful. They're just not within what we think of as the, again, binary possibilities of male or female. Someone can be absolutely healthy and happy and living a joyful, delightful life and have a body that, again, does not fit into these expected binary sex categories, right? Being intersex is not an emergency. It is not a disaster. There are one or two instances in which being intersex can, again, be threatening, tends not to be threatening in the moment, tends not to pose a serious obstacle to one's flourishing or well-being until quite a bit later on, if at all. Many people, in fact, don't even know that they are intersex. Because remember, doctors tend to just look at one's external genitalia. It's not usually a reason to gather information about an infant's internal reproductive organs. It's not usually reason to, test an infant's chromosomes to see what the configuration actually is. We don't usually gather this information right as somebody is born. And so there might not be a reason to gather this information until much, much, much later on in life, if at all, right? So most people find out that they're intersex, around puberty, if things aren't developing in sort of the expected way. However, if they are identified as intersex when they're born, here's what happens. The doctors declare a medical emergency. Then they go to the parents and say, there's a medical emergency that we need to address with your newborn infant. Now think about the mindset of that parent or those parents, whether they just gave birth either vaginally or through a C-section, whether they are not somebody who is gestating and so are not the one giving birth, whether they recently adopted and welcomed in this child into their family, regardless of which position they're inhabiting, they have a new infant. That is stressful and overwhelming and terrifying. And all you want to do is just protect that baby. And a doctor just came and said, there is something wrong with your baby. It's something really technical and you might not understand it, but here's what we think we should do, right? So the doctors are not going to force parents into performing a surgery, but they are going to recommend it. This is the history of how intersex babies have been treated. Doctors declare a medical emergency, say that we need to intervene and alter the baby's either internal reproductive organs or their external genitalia or both. They recommend it to these very stressed out, very vulnerable parents. And parents, because if you have somebody who just said, your baby's in danger, here's what we recommend doing, most parents are gonna go along with it, right? So I don't want us to fall into this like parents as monsters mindset. Even the doctors, I'm not sure that it's useful to think of the doctors as monsters here. They're doing what they were trained in medical school to do in these moments. The reason they say they need to, again, do these sorts of medical interventions immediately on this newborn is because they say that it will harm the child if they are not clearly and easily classified as either male or female. It's not clear how it's going to harm that child. They're really drawing on that binary view of biological sex and biological gender. They're really drawing on this idea that you need to be able to know somebody's biological sex so that you can either establish or figure out what their binary gender is, and therefore you can, again, raise them within that gender correctly. But instead, we're doing these medical interventions on brand new infants. Doctors declare a medical emergency and they have to figure out whether they're going to classify a child as male or female. They start off by seeing whether they can classify the child as male. The ways that they do this is they look to the external reproductive organs. They say, okay, so we've got something that could either be a small penis or a large clitoris. What's going to be the criteria we will use in order to determine which it is? I kid you not, the actual medical criteria, this is in many articles and books, is doctors look at whether the resulting child will be able to pee standing up and penetrate vaginas. And if the genitalia will not be able to allow the grown child, as an adult then, to pee standing up and penetrate vaginas, then they classify the child as female and alter their genital genitals to look something much more similar to sort of normative expectations of a vulva and a clitoris. If they think that they can, again, modify the child's genitalia so that they will have genitalia that looks according to expectations for a penis, and they will be able to, it's going to keep repeating it, pee standing up and penetrate vaginas, then they classify the child as male and say, okay, you should raise them as a boy. So several things here. One is that they're explicitly drawing on that binary view of the relationship between sex and gender. They believe that you need to be able to clearly and distinctly classify somebody in accordance with one of those two biological sex identities in order to figure out whether they will then be a woman or a man on the basis of their assigned biological sex. But the ways that this process works also reveals quite a bit about how we think about those categories of biological sex. Those criteria that I just repeated many times, that they think that in order to be male, somebody has to be able to pee standing up and penetrate vaginas. That criteria is drawing on social norms. We are drawing on our social gendered norms to establish the boundaries and criteria of our biological sex categories, right? We are saying that part of what it is to have the biology of being male is to pee standing up. It's not about biology. That's about different ways that you could organize your body while peeing. I also say that in order to be biologically male, one needs to be able to penetrate vaginas with their external genitalia. Quite a bit is being built into that too. There are a whole bunch of expectations right there. Oh, expectations that somebody who is male, and on this view, a man, is going to grow up to, first of all, be interested in sexual activity. Second of all, be interested in sexual activity with people who have vaginas. Third of all, on this view, that means interested in sexual activity with people who have vaginas who are then assumed to be women. So they're also assumed that somebody who is male is also straight and is interested in a particular kind of sexual activity, that is penis and vagina sex. Those were a whole bunch of gender norms all of a sudden being used to figure out biological sex. Oh, so now it starts to seem like this isn't something that is just a natural category. It's not something that we could just go out and look in nature and say, yes, this is what it is to be male and this is what it is to be female. In fact, we actually are looking at our gender norms to construct, maintain, figure out the contours of those biological sex categories. So under the binary view, sex comes first and then there's gender. But now it starts to look like maybe we actually start off with our gender norms and use our assumptions and our expectations about gender to then classify people into these biological sex categories. So those categories of sex and gender, it's not obvious that they're as distinct as we might think that they are, as we might have started off thinking that they are. And crucially, it's not obvious that our biological sex category holds up in the way that many of us are taught to believe that it would hold up. It's not clear that there are, first of all, only two categories. Once again, intersex folks exist. Even more than that, this history of erasure, the history of declaring a medical emergency in order to erase the existence of intersex folks, serves as a way to naturalize and reinforce the belief that these binary sex categories are natural, that they're found in nature, that there are only two. The fact that we, I don't know how else to put it, erase, we literally alter the bodies of incredibly vulnerable tiny babies in order to make it seem like there are only these two categories, that we don't keep thinking about it. People aren't usually doing this, like cartoon villainy, with a cartoon villain mindset. Rather, they're doing the things that they were also taught in medical school. They're doing the things that they've been taught is for the well-being of that baby, of that child. once again, we are all enmeshed in these disciplinary processes where it's not one person with this centralized power and authority making things shitty for everyone else. It's distributed throughout our society, and it shows up in all of these little ways, from the ways that the doctors themselves were trained to the fact that, oh, parents in these really stressed out moments might worry about what their child's life would be like because they will always have to check the box that says other on those forms that say, what is your gender? And then only list male and female, which again, very confused on those forms. The fact that there are only two options most of the time, I mean, that's a tiny little thing that happens over and over and over again. One might worry about how that would affect a child. But instead of saying, okay, we should do something to change the world, the solution that the doctors and the parents are using right here is to say, okay, we need to be the ones then to alter and reshape our child so that they don't then suffer as they move through the world. We need to be the ones to impose these norms so that other people don't try to impose them on our child. Essentially, we're going to be the ones to hurt this kid so that other people don't hurt them. We're going to hurt them first, which is fairly concerning and worth continuing to think about. Wow, this got dark. Basically, I want to make sure that we are thinking about these constructions of sex and gender, that we are aware that intersex folks exist and absolutely are a deeply standard normal identity to have, and that we should not continue on with this sort of erasure. And finally, while I have talked about this as the sort of medical response, as being a traditional medical response, and as some of the readings identify that this practice is changing, I also want to make sure I note it's not changing that fast. It is very much still ongoing at hospitals across the United States. It is very much something that there is little data on because each individual, both state and then within that, each individual hospital has its own rules and policies and regulations about this. And there is very little data that is collected on any of it. Whew. All right, so we are once again going to continue to think about the ways in which these identity categories are constructed and the effects that they have as we all move through the world in our daily lives.